Good evening. Today I'd like to talk about another might-have-been tube proposal. This one comes from the 1989 Central London Rail Study, and it was a proposal to extend the Jubilee line to Ilford. Now these days, the Jubilee line terminates at Stratford, and if you want to get to Ilford, you have to change onto the Elizabeth line. But back in the 80s, they had other ideas. So the first thing you need to know is that the Jubilee line was very much shorter in those days. It ran from Stanmore in London's western suburbs to Charing Cross in central London. The line in this form had opened in 1979. Now, it had always been intended to extend it from here, but exactly where to, well, that was the question. Either way, the plan was to extend it through the city and out the other side. The most likely routes were either southeast to Lewisham and New Cross Gate, or east through the Docklands, with an eventual terminus in Thamesmead. But it was something of a moot point in the early 80s because the government didn't want to spend the money on a tube line. While East and Southeast London needed regeneration in the wake of the closure of the old docks, it was assumed that the regeneration would be fairly small scale. Low-rise housing and light industry, maybe the odd small office block here and there. A tube line was considered to be using a sledgehammer to crack an egg, so instead the Docklands Light Railway was built. Meanwhile, in central London, the tube lines were overcrowded, especially the Central Line. I mean, the Central Line is always overcrowded no matter what they do. They could hollow out the entire earth under London and run track through every free space, and the Central Line would still be overcrowded. But you know what wasn't overcrowded? The Jubilee line. Because, well, half of it hadn't been built. So naturally the question arose, could that take some of the strain off the Central? Various ideas were proposed, of which the Ilford extension was one. From Charing Cross, the line would extend east to Ludgate, likely to where City Thameslink is now. I'm only speculating here, but I reckon that had this been built, there would have been interchange with Thameslink here. The report does talk quite a lot about Thameslink. From here there were two possibilities. In one, the line would have gone to London Bridge and terminated. The other would have gone on from here to Liverpool Street and then Whitechapel. One version of the plan had Whitechapel as the terminus, working on the basis that the section from Whitechapel to Liverpool Street would be the most crowded. However, if it did not terminate there, it would have gone on to Stratford, and here there are two more possibilities. One would have gone on to Leytonstone, and I presume this would have involved duplicating the Central line. I can't imagine that the Central would have had capacity for Jubilee line trains as well as its own. At Leytonstone it would take over the Central line to Hainault and terminate there. The other version would have gone on to Ilford. The plan identifies two stations between Stratford and Ilford, but it doesn't name them, and intriguingly, they don't directly correspond to any existing station. I'll just give them placeholder names for now. None of this actually happened. The argument against was that the benefits just didn't stack up against the cost, and the only part that was worthwhile was the bit in the city. It was also thought that the tube would likely prove slower than the existing trains from Ilford, and so it was unlikely that they'd provide an attractive alternative. We would have to wait until 1999 to get a Jubilee line extension, and the route it took would totally bypass the city. But I think there are some interesting things to note in this plan, vis-à-vis what we actually got. The extension to London Bridge interests me, because of what was happening elsewhere. At that time, the developers of Canary Wharf were pushing to get their own private railway. This would have run from Waterloo through London Bridge onto the Docklands and terminated at Westcombe Park. Options were also floated for extensions into the West End, to Woolwich and Thamesmead, and to Stratford. The thinking was that this railway could do a lot of the work of the Jubilee line extension. Why build a line to Stratford when you can use someone else's? Intriguingly, though, the report mentions that they were considering the idea of once again building a tube line through the Docklands from London Bridge. This, combined with the Canary Wharf private railway scheme, really is not far off the extension we got. As for the rest, I'm getting a bit of Elizabeth line déjà vu. The Elizabeth line meets both the Central and Jubilee lines at Bond Street. It goes to Farringdon, not far from Ludgate, then on to Liverpool Street, Whitechapel, Stratford and Ilford. It does indeed follow much of the Central Line route and then some. And one of the major considerations of the Elizabeth Line route was that it should take crowds off the Central Line. I think that what we can conclude from all this is that while these versions of the Jubilee extension didn't seem like a good idea at the time, they provided some inspiration for the future. Well, it is my fond hope that you enjoyed this evolutionary tale from the Tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like, as ever, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your always generous support. You are the interchange to my London Bridge. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.